Now, if you're gonna make a series of videos talking about the monsters of Monster Hunter, there's a right way and a wrong way to do it. You pay your respects to the king first. You do your due diligence to Rathalos. You put the mascot at the front. But just because Rathalos is the most famous and important monster, don't mean he's the best. Because, kids, that which stands above a king is an emperor.
In the halls of Inferno roam the restless souls. The lone monarch approaches with the fire he controls. He's here to judge the wicked who sully his domain. To damn them with his rage to eternal pain. Swift as wind his punishment, absolute his reign.
Have you ever had a white whale in a video game? That boss you couldn't beat, that collectible you could never find, that trial you never completed, that challenge that stuck with you for hours and hours, and that surge of relief and exhilaration you felt when you finally completed it? Or perhaps you never finished that challenge and it still haunts you to this day. Let me tell you my story. The story of my white whale. The story that turned Teostra into my favorite monster and why he will never, ever be dethroned. As I said in my Rathalos video, Monster Hunter Tri was my first game in the franchise. And man, did I fall in love with that game. And the series. And I wanted to know everything. I distinctly remember flipping through the Monster Hunter wikis and looking at all the creatures from previous games, marveling at years of established Monster Hunter history that I had no idea existed. After it was apparent that my brother and I adored Tri, my dad offered to buy us a PSP so we could play the previous games. So I got my hands on Monster Hunter Freedom Unite, which was more or less the culmination of every main series game up to that point, before the massive turnaround that was Monster Hunter Tri. Also, in the Rathalos video, I think I made it sound as though I dislike the classic Monster Hunter games from the first and second generations. I really don't. They've simply aged and have some discernible flaws that have been ironed out in future games. I sunk hundreds of hours into Freedom Unite and made more than one profile, was never particularly great at it, and didn't know how a lot of mechanics worked, but I didn't care. I brought that thing everywhere, played it everywhere. Up in high school, I played that game non-stop. Now, For those of you who are recent partakers in the hunting of monsters, way back in the old games, the bulk of the Elder Dragons you could fight on normal maps had a mechanic where if they were below a certain health threshold, 25 minutes had elapsed in the quest, and the Elder Dragon was not dead, it would be repelled and leave the quest, rather than run the full timer. It could then be fought again, with its broken parts still battered, carrying over most of the damage it suffered in your previous encounter, appearing on a different map, and occasionally, when you return from the first quest to hunt it, you might not have another on the list with that Elder Dragon immediately. For the sake of expediency, I understand why this isn't a thing anymore, but man, this mechanic made Elder Dragons feel mythical, powerful, mysterious. It felt like you chased them all over the world. And when they didn't appear on the quest board, you felt this impatience, like you were waiting for the guild to track this foe down, so you could resume the hunt. This mechanic created this illusion that you were fighting a singular dragon across days and across the continent. It created a rivalry. I miss this mechanic, if I'm being honest. This idea of repelling and pursuing elders started to fade away in the 3rd and 4th generation, and eventually it just never came back. It's unfortunate. Yeah, sure, it takes away from the game, but it was immensely immersive. So my first profile in Freedom Unite, I was not good at the game. I did not know what skills were. I only looked at the defense and elemental resistance numbers when making armor. I played bow. I had no idea how to properly play bow. To put it lightly, my hunts in Freedom Unite took a lot longer than they had any reason to, because I was stupid. I wound up abandoning that profile and starting again with Longsword because I couldn't beat a double Diablos quest. So I beat the Elder Dragons, one by one. Kieran, Camelios, Lunastra, and Kushala Daora. Minus Kieran, each took me about 2 hunts. All 5-star low-rank quests. Then I hit 6 stars. And there was one new Elder Dragon, Teostra. Couldn't be that much worse than the Lunastra. It was just a color swap with some higher health and damage. 4 hunts. 4 hunts and 2 real-world days. Now, I'm not 100% sure how the Elder Dragon Repel quests work in terms of how the game is programmed. If the Elder Dragon's damage taken carries over every single time until you finally get it, or if it ever resets, I'm not sure. But that's the game code. Regardless of whether or not I fought the same cluster of programming or not, doesn't really matter. I fought that same Teostra 4 times across deserts, in the heart of volcanoes, minimal other quests in between. I chased that thing to the ends of the earth, and on the 4th try, it finally went down. Teostra became my favorite monster of all time the second I slew him, and I never looked back. So that's my story. But let's take a look at what my all-time favorite actually is. Teostra is a dark gray, violet-scaled, lion-like elder dragon, sporting a brilliant red mane, prominent elongated fangs, distinct towering horns, powerful wings coated in powdery scales, a long tail with a red tuft of fur, and soul-piercing blue eyes. It bears resemblance to the mythical Manticore of ancient Persian mythology. He was introduced in Monster Hunter 2 or Monster Hunter DOS, a game that never came to the West. We didn't see him until Monster Hunter Freedom 2 came stateside on the PSP. In that game, he was considered one member of an Elder Dragon trinity, with Kushala Daora and Camelios, the 3 having a rock-paper-scissors set of abilities that could counter one another. To this day, Kushala Daora and Teostra remain packaged as direct rivals, are seen as staple Elder Dragons, appearing more often than pretty much any of their cohorts, and are nowadays viewed more as equals, whereas Camelios kinda just wanders off and appears when he feels like it. Teostra ranks amongst the weaker Elder Dragons, which of course means he's a walking inferno capable of roasting a full-grown human alive merely by standing next to him, can obliterate a village effortlessly, possesses supernatural control over fire, can deal cataclysmic damage to fortified human settlements, and sightings of them are cause for the guild to panic. So yeah, you know, a pretty weak Elder Dragon, small-scale stuff. He is an immensely proud, regal, territorial, and brutal monster. A sort of dignified savagery. In the old games, Teostra was characterized as pretty indiscriminately hostile, but when World came around, perhaps because these are technically much older Teostra, they seem to calm down a little, only attack when provoked, and generally regard non-aggressive humans as nothing to be concerned over. This behavior change is what injected more of the noble, prideful aspect to his personality, and helped flesh him out a lot more. He gained these new idle animation, wouldn't even regard the player hunter without being attacked. Most dragons of his frame share these different animations and stances with him. Relaxed, aloof, upright, and pristine when not engaged in combat, and low to the ground and bestial when angered. But they work exceptionally well for him, matching his personality perfectly. Like the Wraths, the fire dragons are a part of a sexually dimorphic species, Teostra being the male and Lunastra being the female. Teostra is the much more commonly seen of the two, appearing in nearly every game since its inception, save for the third generation titles. Lunastra, on the other hand, has been a much more mysterious creature, disappearing off the guild's radar for years, until reappearing in the New World continent in Monster Hunter World. In a meta sense, this is likely due to the fact that the developers had no idea how to differentiate her from Teostra for a very long time. They shared a near-identical moveset in their original incarnations. The two have almost never been seen together, preferring solitary lifestyles until the need to procreate comes calling. But when they do come together, they are immensely loyal, fiercely protective, and nigh unstoppable. Monsters capable of easily dealing with a Lunastra or Teostra separately hardly stand a chance of dealing with the pair combined. It wasn't until Monster Hunter World that we got to see the two fight in tandem, and what a spectacle it is. In a mechanic almost completely unique to them, barring some monsters from Frontier, Teostra and Lunastra can combine their strength together, empowering each other's fire on a level capable of reducing all else to ash around them. I'll talk more about Lunastra in her own separate video, but you can't really talk about Teostra without mentioning her. Teostra is an absolute master of the fire element. The most obvious presentation of this is his ability to project a consistent flamethrower breath attack and detonate explosions around him. But his control goes beyond the immediately noticeable bombast. He can manipulate an aura of fire, encompassing his whole body to the point where he can determine which parts of himself are encased in said flames. The fire of his aura is so potent, it can annihilate arrows and bowgun ammo instantly upon impact, and can gradually burn a hunter to death simply by standing next to them. His control of fire is thought to be attributed to his horns, as destroying them could nullify his fire aura in the old games. Doing so never got rid of his fire attacks, though. The feature he's probably most famous for is the powdery scales he stores in his wings and mane. Beats of said wings kick up the powder and disperse it in small clouds. When scattered, Teostra will gnash its teeth, creating a spark, and detonate these clouds in a cacophony of explosions at a close to mid-range. It has two states of combat, one in which it focuses on fire, and one where it expels these powdered clouds in greater quantities. In order to maintain the heat energy needed to fuel its production of fire and explosive powder, Teostra survives mostly on a diet of ores and gunpowder. Elder dragons, just as a general category, are incredibly rare, enormously mysterious, and have powers that defy current understanding. Comparatively, among this group, Teostra are one of the more common, one of the better documented, and one of the more tracked elders by the Hunters Guild. Whenever one pops up, it is monitored as much as is possible. A Teostra in a foul mood could mean the overnight incineration of an entire village if the guild isn't careful. Teostra's evolution has been one of consistently masterful overhauls that has allowed him to go far beyond being the fire dragon. Seriously, that's technically the name of the species shared by Teostra and Lunastra. In the first and second generations, he really only had 3 fire abilities: his passive flame aura, his sweeping flamethrower, and his AoE powder explosions. They detonate in a ring around him. Red powder for point blank, yellow for a mid distance. Learning that gimmick was how you'd know whether or not to capitalize on a damage opportunity or get out of the way. On top of these abilities, he had a fairly standard close combat moveset. Charge attacks, forward and backward leaps to reposition or leap at a target, claw swipes, and tail sweeps. His charges and forward leaps from old games were much maligned for coming out fast and having virtually no telegraph to them. Very easy to catch someone unaware. Instant charges, especially out of a roar, are certainly not specific to Teostra, and they are an aspect of classic Monster Hunter that is better left in the past, with a few notable exceptions where it's baked into the ferocity, personality, difficulty, and intelligence of a monster's moveset. Teostra and the other small-scale Elder Dragons took a break during the 3rd generation and reappeared in the 4th. During this time, Brachydios had been introduced, and brought with him the Slime status, which functioned both as a negative status ailment and a weapon status. Instead of creating a host of new slime monsters, the developers retooled and created a number of monsters that dealt with explosions, and rebranded Slime as Blast. Still functionally the same, but now more broadly applicable. The implementation of Blast changed Teostra immensely, and has led to an incredible ramp-up in his toolkit. Now his paw swipes and tail attacks can dispense clouds of blast powder, which will cling to the player if they make contact, detonating after a period of time or detonating for extra damage if you're hit by an explosion. It was the 4th generation that also introduced easily his most iconic move, the Supernova. After 100 seconds of being enraged, Teostra would leap up into the air, curl into a ball, bring all his power into himself, and release an enormously powerful explosion around him. Any hunter that survived contact with this move would automatically be stunned. His G-rank fight in the 4th generation further expanded on this move by launching a massive amount of powder forwards and using a beat of his wings to force it all together, effectively turning his Nova into a forward launch projectile. This was an enormously influential attack. A monster having a high damage signature move with a name attached to it was not a concept that was around much back then. Now it's a staple of Elder Dragons and high-level monster toolkits. Having an attack like this is simply an expectation of Monster Hunter's upper echelon nowadays. Hell, even monsters on the lower rungs of the power ladder are starting to get more iconic moves like this. And these moves have gotten more varied and creative as they've gone on. Teostra and his Supernova are without a doubt some of the major catalysts of this trend that has added a further level of grandiose spectacle and identity to the games. I'm sure stuff like this existed in Frontier beforehand, but this was pretty new for the main series games. Now, one might think that Teostra's massive overhaul and game-changing new attack meant that his improvements would slow down in the 5th generations. He's a member of the old guard. He's had his major impact. He's earned his place on the roster as a comfort pick. Yeah, not even close. At all. The development team decided that it wasn't enough that Teostra was a master of fire and a blast. Now he should have varied states, one focused on fire, one focused on blast. Oh, and he can get in more intense versions of these states when enraged, where he starts glowing like a furnace and gets faster and stronger and builds on his attacks even more. By the time of his master rank iteration in World, Teostra now had close range fire and blast bursts. This point-blank explosion right in his face that he'd used to retreat and combo into a diving attack. Downward pointed flame breath that shot out in all directions at close range, and a much easier time passively dropping clouds of his volatile blast powder. Additionally, his Nova was given a much slower charge up and a larger blast radius. In the 4th generation, his Nova would consume so much heat that it extinguished his flame aura. Now it just swaps in between his fire and blast states. His reviled instant charges were gone, and now replaced with a varied toolkit that shifted throughout the fight, as well as a vast new pool of moves that covered some of his old blind spots. And they all feel fair and fun to deal with. Rise reunited the classic Elder Dragon trio in its first title update, reintroducing Chameleos after a prolonged absence. They added a few cool changes to Teostra here. The most prominent is the improved intelligence of his AI. He very easily drops his blast powder passively during completely separate attacks, and now tries to knock you into them. His speed and player tracking have also been upgraded. As is expected of Rise, his attacks now chain together and flow much more naturally than they ever have, leading to combos he simply never had access to before. My favorite being this new double paw swipe into a full body spin that he got in this game. Teostra went from a decent fight with a limited move pool and exasperating qualities to a blast in the 5th generation. The loss of his instant charges, as well as general quality of life improvements, made him easier in the right ways. He's still a proper challenge. The sheer quantity of blast powder he can dispense requires awareness of surroundings in order to properly deal with him. His dual states prevent his fight from feeling repetitive. His iconic Nova is always something you need to keep in the back of your head. His improved intelligence and attack combinations make him lethal if he catches you not paying attention. His difficulty feels perfect now, and the sheer depth of his moveset makes him far more engaging than his classic iteration. Although his fight and personality have seen consistently massive changes that have had lasting impacts on him and the monsters around him, the evolution in Teostra's design has been far less drastic. As is typical of 5th generation monsters, his model is of a much higher quality. He's a bit bulkier than he once was, and his colors have been desaturated a bit. Most prominently, he used to have more red scales on his upper body that would bleed into the darker violet at his underbelly and feet. Now his whole body mainly just has the ashy, purple-looking scales. I'm really hoping that Monster Hunter 6 puts some more color back into the monsters, as well as the games themselves. Though not awful, the color is probably my least favorite aspect of the art direction in the 5th generation. The fidelity is there, but the vibrancy is not. 4th generation is probably my favorite Teostra design. The colors are great, and his flame aura looks as though there's fire flowing throughout the entirety of his mane and coating his claws. Though I wish it had a full body effect. The original flame aura kinda just looks like flickering orange wind, and the 5th generation aura has better fire effects on his limbs and body, and a cool internal glow in his mane, but lacks the style of the 4th generation version, lighting his whole head on fire. There's a vibrant, high-resolution Teostra with a perfect flame aura out there somewhere. Hopefully, I just gotta wait till the next game comes out to see it. Come to think of it, that's another thing 6 needs to fix from the 5th generation. They neutered the particle effects off of some of the monsters, like, really bad. My two favorite additions to his design are the increased glow to the blue of his eyes and the furry texture added to his wings. There's a lot of menace, intelligence, and life in his glare. I have next to no knowledge on artistic design or color theory, but it almost kinda feels like the bright blue eyes and duller colors on the rest of his body might have been a purposeful design choice. Looking at his renderings, your eye gets drawn to his, almost as if it's forcing you to look this emperor in the eye, acknowledge it as a fellow intelligent being, an equal, distinguishing it above a common animal. I could just be making up a bunch of bullshit. I have no idea, but that's what popped into my head. As for the texture in his wings, it simply adds a visual component to enhance the comprehension of his abilities. We always knew he was kicking up powdery clouds of scales from his wings, but the original model lacked the technology to show them. Now, they're clearly on display when looking at his render. Teostra has one of my favorite armor sets of all time. Not the high rank version though. That one's fine, passable. It's red knight armor with a kinda neat little shoulder cape thing. I don't love these weird gear things it's got going on, but I suppose they don't ruin anything. The set's fine, just doesn't stand out. The master rank set, on the other hand. Oh, now this is what I'm talking about. You look like this red lion warrior king. The prominent Teostra horns, the mane of fur behind you and lining the cape, the aforementioned massive cape that wraps around to the shoulders, the badass looking glare on the helmet, the gorgeous red metal with twinges of orange and violet. It's perfect in terms of what it sets out to accomplish as a design and for my personal aesthetic tastes. I don't just make it in every game, I beeline it to make this set as soon as I can. Best part, Teostra armor is typically pretty fantastic too in terms of its skills. And even if it wasn't, that's what layered armor's for. His weapons match the regal, ceremonial lion knight vibe that his armor exudes. And I think ceremonial is the best way to describe his gear. Practically, you wouldn't wear or use this stuff on an actual battlefield. This would be the armor a royal would place on display for everyone to see. I especially love the Teostra sword and shield that has a smaller sword sheathed in the shield. The longsword is another of my favorites, having a curved katana-looking blade, yet the guard looks like that of a fencing saber. The switch axe is this great-looking full red axe with these deep orange blades and a lion crest with a crown-like decoration atop it. And the heavy bowgun is just a Teostra-colored cannon, like they plucked the siege weapon off its support and wheels and started carrying it around. It's so simple that it's almost kind of goofy looking. And the rest of his gear looks pretty great as well. I mentioned in the Rathalos video that I loved that his set looked like knight armor with purposefully arranged dragon bits to enhance it. Yeah, we moved away from that kind of fast. Most armor sets look like they're inspired by the monster rather than made out of their parts. It's not a complaint. Honestly, as cool of a concept as the pieces of plate metal armor set idea is, and how well it was executed for Rathalos, it could get repetitive very easily. And we all remember the actual tragedy that was half of World's weapon design, from which we have yet to fully recover. I have no issue with this direction, but it does shake up my immersion just a little when I'm collecting scales, horns, claws, and wing membranes to forge metal armor. Has there ever been a lore explanation for this? The guys who make this game think about their world a lot, so I'm curious if there's actually an answer. If I have one regret about the Rathalos video, it's that I offered absolutely no elaboration on the versions of Rathalos from games I hadn't played, and wrote many of them off as Rathalos with more fire. Now, in some cases that's true, but I do think they deserved a little bit better. Teostra has 4 variations: Hardcore Teostra, Supremacy Teostra, Risen Teostra, and Toa Tesukatora. For those of you with little to no understanding of how Monster Hunter Frontier worked, it can be a little confusing and seemingly repetitive to explain the powered-up versions of their monsters. Frontier was an MMO that ran for a long time and had a steady power creep. I'm not an expert on this game's history, but from what I can tell, it had numerous major overhauls, and with those overhauls came a slew of smaller expansions. As the game went on, they added multiple new gimmicks to power up their monster roster. A lot of these gimmicks are functionally similar, minor design overhauls with crazy new additions to movesets. Hardcore, or HC monsters, and Supremacy monsters from Frontier don't seem to have too much different about them fundamentally, save for minor tweaks in the design, varying difficulty, and when they were added. They are simply harder fights on an existing monster, with enormously over-the-top attacks, massive AoEs, and amplifications to the abilities the monsters already had. Supremacy is far and away the more over-the-top of the two. The air explodes behind him simply when he runs. Swiping his paws triggers massive detonations, and he can encompass damn near the entire arena in an immense tornado of fire, which he then detonates inside. Hardcore Teostra has a similar yet smaller tornado ability, and many of his explosions have these cool, lingering fire effects. Risen Teostra is pretty similar to the Hardcore and Supremacy versions. Design tweak, more attacks, super crazy difficulty, etc, etc. But the Risen monsters from Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak have the advantage of having their transformation being tied into the game's story, overcoming the rampant affliction consuming the monsters in the game and turning said affliction's power into their own strength. His design overhaul is a bit more striking than that of the aforementioned two as well. His fur goes from bright red to nearly shock white blonde. New patterns on his wings, more bioluminescent glowing, bright blue flames enveloping his paws, and a darkened hide with glowing orange yellow between the scales. And when he powers up to his risen state, he glows all over with brilliant yellow and orange accents across his body. His risen form has even more mix-ups and variations on his attack patterns, and an enhanced version of his supernova that shoots out additional fire projectiles. If I'm being honest, Rise's prolonged attack combinations and mix-ups that require telegraph knowledge, good reflexes, and proper timing is a better method of implementing difficulty than the machine gun of arena-encompassing AoE attacks that Frontier's more powerful monsters will sometimes default to. Very different games, very different mentality, but I do have a preference. As for my favorite, and by far the most interesting Teostra variation, there's Toa Tesukatora, Teostra's origin species. This is another of Frontier's powered-up monster gimmicks, with this one being a lot more creative, making an ancestor of the monster in question. Technically a different species of animal. Toa Tesseract is quite obviously an ice-based ancestor of Teostra, sporting a much different horn design, a mane that looks like it's made out of icicles, and a pretty fantastic color scheme. Basically, think whatever Teostra does with fire, Toa does with ice. Instead of leaving trails of explosive powder when he runs, Toa leaves a jagged frozen wall. Instead of covering you in explosive dust, he entombs you in ice. Instead of covering the entire area in explosions, he covers it in a blizzard and massive falling icicles. My only gripe is that the giant icicles floating in the air are a bit too cartoony. I would love to see Toa brought into a mainline game. I think he looks exceptional, adds a great variety to Teostra, and alters his abilities in a sensible way. He's a fantastic monster. Teostra was a perfect storm for me. Lions are probably my favorite real-world animal. As a fantasy-loving guy, I believe I am legally obligated to like dragons. And Monster Hunter was rapidly becoming my favorite series of video games at the time. And to have this experience with this monster at that time in my life was immensely impactful on me. I don't think I'll ever forget it. I brought down my target after hours of pursuit. Years and years ago now, and I still remember that feeling of triumph. In the years since, and in the years going forward, there are dozens of monsters I have come to adore, and I'm certain that the imminent Monster Hunter 6, or whatever comes next, will bring a vast swath of brand new fantastic monsters. But none of them have or will knock Teostra off of my personal top spot. Nothing is going to match that experience, and that's okay. I don't need anything to. I don't need to chase that sensation. Other monsters have and will create their own memories for me, and have their own impact, and leave their own mark. But the Emperor will always sit on the throne. Even in the face of a better fight, or a cooler monster design, or a better armor set, or more interesting variations, the Emperor remains eternal, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you for the influx of new viewers and subscribers that have joined the channel recently. I keep saying it, but I'm floored by how well this channel is doing for how young it is. Tell me what you think of Teostra, and tell me what you think is the objectively best monster. If you've enjoyed yourself, go ahead and hit like, subscribe, and hit the bell for future content, and may the Emperor reign forever.